Exploring the timeline of The Bear and Bird is like putting together all the jiggy pieces of a world puzzle, and eventually everything becomes clear. So grab your Banjo-Kazooie stuffed animal and your Diddy Kong Racing Banjo action figure, and let's go on a rare journey of the official timeline of one of the most famous duos of all time, Banjo-Kazooie. Chapter 1. Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, 1995-1996. According to the manual of Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo the Bear was all by himself in the 1997 racing game, as it states, before his start with his future partnership with Kazooie. So as much as we fantasized as kids that Kazooie must be in Banjo's backpack in Diddy Kong Racing, this was actually before he met the famous Kazooie. According to the story and lore of Diddy Kong Racing, Diddy was actually friends with Banjo, Conker, and Pipsy the Mouse prior to the events of the racing game. And Diddy had sent Banjo a letter delivered by Squawks the Parrot to ask him to come to Timber's Island to help him defeat WizpIg. This would have to mean the beginning of the Banjo-Kazooie timeline has to take place during the events of the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, during the Super Nintendo days, since Banjo has to have met Diddy prior, and he knows who Squawks is. Now, I believe that Banjo used to live in the Northern Cremisphere, seen in Donkey Kong Country 3. This would be 1996. However, Donkey Kong Country 3 stars Dixie Kong and Kiddy Kong, not Donkey Kong and Diddy, because they were captured by Chaos, or King K. Rool, and both Donkey Kong and Diddy do appear at the end. So in order for Diddy to have met Banjo, Diddy had to have been traveling around in the Northern Cremisphere, in between the events of Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, because at the beginning of Donkey Kong Country 3, Diddy is captured. So in 1995, early 1996, Diddy met and befriended Banjo the Bear, because the Northern Cremisphere has a lot of bears that look like Banjo. Also, an important thing to note is that the entire Banjo-Kazooie saga does actually take place in the 1990s, in-universe. We know this because Wrinkly Kong can be seen playing the Nintendo 64 in Donkey Kong Country 3, which takes place in 1996. Plus more evidence that it's the 90s is Donkey Kong and Diddy having their boombox. With its design, it comes straight out of the 90s. More evidence the rest of the games actually take place in the 90s, or more evident as we go along. Chapter 2. Diddy Kong Racing, 1997. Banjo is just one of the many amazing animal characters in the adventure that takes place on Timber's Island in 1997. Banjo can be seen flying an airplane in the intro. This is foreshadowing to how he'll eventually be able to fly in the air with his future buddy, Kazooie. The manual also states that Banjo isn't one to turn down the chance for adventure. Ah, the 90s. A time where every cool animal character loved going on adventures. After Banjo receives the letter from Squawks the Parrot, the manual states, the honey bear stuffs a few things into his trusty backpack and takes to his heels. This also implies to me that Kazooie wouldn't be in his backpack, cause I imagine that when Kazooie was in his backpack, it would only be her in there, cause there wouldn't be any room for anything else. So the epic adventure ensues. Banjo helps Timber the Tiger to defeat the evil WizpIg. On the island, he gets to become friends with all the other Rareware characters, such as Bumper the Badger, Pipsy the Mouse, Timber, TT, and etc. He also meets and gets trained by Taj the Genie in order to help defeat WizpIg once and for all. The adventure he had there is one we will never forget, and 1997 represents a window in time that will never return. This will be the final time Banjo gets to hang out with Diddy, Bumper, Taj, Pipsy, Timber, Drumstick, and TT, because when he meets Kazooie, he becomes way too busy to hang out with them again. And that's life. The only character Banjo will run into again is Tip-Tup the Turtle, who appears in both Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. Chapter 3. Banjo gets adopted by the Kazuls, 1997. The next chapter takes place right after the events of Diddy Kong Racing, where we can assume that Banjo returns to his home in the Northern Hemisphere. Soon afterwards, he meets Kazooie, and the two become best friends. It's important to note the Diddy Kong Racing action figure of Banjo from 1997, which tells us a very important piece of information. It states that Banjo found himself adopted by the Kazuls. Now, according to one of the rare creators of Banjo-Kazooie, this was a typo, but I think it goes much deeper than that. By Kazuls, this must mean Kazooie's family, and perhaps the typo meant Kazoo and not Kazooie. I say this because the original beta title for Banjo-Kazooie was Banjo-Kazooie, so apparently Kazooie's name was just going to be simply named after the musical instrument, but it was eventually changed to Kazooie, so Banjo was adopted by the Kazoos. Well, Kazooie's last name could be Kazoo. Her name could be Kazooie Kazoo, matching the letters of the first and last name, similar to Banjo Bear, a very common trait when naming animal characters, like Bugs Bunny, for example, or Daffy Duck with the double letters, or Mickey Mouse, for example. Now, it claims that Banjo was not just befriended, but adopted. This heavily implies that Banjo is an orphan. I wonder what happened to his parents. Were they killed by one of the animals in the Northern Hemisphere? It does kind of make sense to me that Banjo would be an orphan, because all the bears in Donkey Kong Country 3 have their own house and seem to be by themselves. Also, since the Diddy Kong Racing manual says that this is before Banjo met Kazooie, so this must mean that the event of Banjo being adopted by Kazooie has to take place after the events of Diddy Kong Racing. So eventually, Chapter 3 ends with both Banjo and Kazooie leaving the Kazoos in the Northern Hemisphere and moving to Spiral Mountain and having their own house as boyfriend and girlfriend. I mean best friends, whatever. So both Chapter 2 and 3 take place in the amazing year of 1997. Chapter 4, Banjo-Pilot, 1997. Perhaps you all thought the next chapter would be the classic 1998 game Banjo-Kazooie, but we're not there yet. It makes the most sense for Chapter 4 to be the underrated Game Boy Advance game Banjo-Pilot. The biggest piece of evidence for this is due to the fact that Gruntilda the Witch is fully alive. Also, Kazooie is flying around in her own plane. Could this be before she decided to always be in Banjo's backpack? So despite Banjo-Pilot being released in 2005, it actually takes place in 1997. Even Jolly Roger and Humba Wumba are racers. Now that makes things confusing and makes you think that this game must take place after Banjo-Tooie. But Gruntilda is not a skeleton, so that can't be. Perhaps Banjo-Kazooie never really met Humba Wumba and Jolly during this time, and they just happened to see them racing against them, but didn't actually meet them until the events of Banjo-Tooie. Plus, Humba Wumba is actually mentioned in Banjo-Kazooie during Grunty's Furnace Fun, so she did exist in the world of Banjo-Kazooie before the final game. Humba Wumba was around in the 90s, and was still rivals with Mumbo Jumbo, which is why they're racing against each other in Banjo-Pilot. Plus, it makes sense for this to be the follow-up after Diddy Kong Racing, because it's Banjo continuing to race and fly around in a plane, like he was doing before. So, after all the racing is done, Banjo is tired from all his recent adventures, and now falls asleep and hibernates in his house, and can rest for a while. Chapter 5, Banjo-Kazooie, 1998. The next glorious chapter is the original Banjo-Kazooie game. Here, the game begins with Banjo still sleeping, and Kazooie hears something bad going on outside, and falls off the coat rack. It was that nasty Gruntilda, who has captured little Tootie for being super jealous of her beauty. Grunty is so petty. Instead of putting some makeup on and trying to lose a little weight, she decides to just capture and hide away the cutest girl in Spiral Mountain. Girls are so cruel. Anyway, so the greatest adventure ever known now takes place, where the bear and bird go on an adventure we will never forget. And eventually, Banjo runs into Tip-Tup in Bubble Gloop Swamp. We also know that the events of Banjo-Kazooie take place in 1998 because Banjo has a Game Boy that he plays in his house. And the Game Boy was super popular in the 90s. Makes sense. It's what everybody was playing at the time. You wouldn't see a modern person today randomly playing a Game Boy, right? And it's not like Banjo's playing with an iPhone or a tablet. No, it cannot be mistakable. That's a Game Boy. And this is definitely the 90s, baby. Also, Banjo's shell necklace is another indication that this is the 90s. The beach shell necklace was a very popular 90s trend. I remember it well. Banjo thought it was cool as well, because it was the 90s. So, anyway, Grunty is murdered, and Tootie the bear is rescued. And this is the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, Banjo-Kazooie, Grunty's Revenge, 1999. The next chapter in the timeline is not Banjo-Tooie. It is actually the Game Boy Advance game, Grunty's Revenge. Despite the fact that it was released in 2003, the game would have to take place in 1999 because Banjo-Tooie takes place in the year 2000. So, according to the story, the game takes place 2 months after Gruntilda fell from her castle tower. And Klungo, who is still Grunty's servant, builds a robot, and Grunty's spirit is transferred into the robot. And now Gruntilda becomes temporarily a robot, like Mecha-Godzilla. And she is now Mecha-Grunty. I don't know how that works. How can she fully operate the robot if she's a ghost? But whatever, she's a witch, so maybe she has some special powers that enable her to do that. A pretty brilliant idea, honestly. I don't know if it was Klungo's idea or Grunty's, but if it was Grunty's, then it has to be the greatest idea she's ever had, other than turning hot in Banjo-Kazooie, but whatever. So then Grunty time travels back in time and captures Kazooie, preventing Banjo and Kazooie from ever meeting in order to erase her death from history. So Mumbo uses his powers to send Banjo back in time to fix history, and the rest of the game takes place. Banjo meets Kazooie again and eventually defeats Mecha Grunty and restores history, and Gruntilda's spirit returns to underneath the boulder. Chapter 7, Banjo-Tooie, 2000. So we come to the final chapter in the saga of the bear and bird, Banjo-Tooie, which takes place in the year 2000. Gruntilda is now a skeleton, and Bottles the Mole dies, but is eventually reborn at the end of the game, completely pulling a Jesus Christ. I personally think that people are insane to dislike Banjo-Tooie. It's always been just as amazing as the first game, in every way. Both Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie are both masterpieces. In fact, Banjo-Tooie may even be a little better. But anyway, the puzzle is complete. This was the Banjo-Kazooie timeline. I do not count Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts in the timeline because that's during the shitty era of Rare's history as a game company. It is not part or in the style of Rare's Nintendo Golden Gears. Plus, Banjo and Kazooie don't even look the same. And Banjo-Kazooie did appear in Smash Bros., but that's not part of the timeline because all the Smash characters are toys the player is playing with, like Master Hand, which is the whole underlining secret meaning behind Super Smash Bros. Chapter 8, Conker's Bad Fur Day, 2001. As an added bonus, Banjo's head can be seen on the wall in the bar in Conker's Bad Fur Day, and Kazooie's head can be seen on top of an umbrella. This is an indication that Conker's Bad Fur Day confirms that both Banjo and Kazooie are dead, since this game takes place in 2001, a year after the events of Banjo-Tooie. Just like all animals, they eventually were killed. Amazing to think that they would die. Banjo-Kazooie survived every danger that came their way, from dinosaurs, giant sea creatures, dragons, etc. But we all can't live forever. This would also make sense because this was almost the final Rare game before Lucifer, or aka Microsoft, stole them from Nintendo. So Banjo and Kazooie lived and died during the Nintendo 64 era, and eventually were resurrected in Super Smash Bros. 20 years later. But those are toys in the story of Smash Bros., not the real Banjo-Kazooie. But But technically, Banjo was around during the Super Nintendo era, which is pretty mind-blowing to think about. So, long live the saga of one of the greatest duos in the history of pop culture. Please like and subscribe, and please hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any of my uploads. Thanks for watching, everybody. My name is SuperPet98, and have an amazing week. I'll see you all next time.